Affairs don't begin in the bedroom, they begin in childhood. In the part of you that decided she needed to bury her truth just to be loved. The part that's now screaming to be seen. I'm Alex Croxford, and this is the Deeper Love podcast, where we name the shame, face the guilt, and help you find your way back to yourself. So let's begin. If you had met me 7 years ago, I would have rolled my eyes at everything I'm about to tell you. I thought crystals were bollocks. I thought energy healing was bollocks. I thought past lives were definitely bollocks. I believed that we were born and we lived on Earth and then we died, and that was it. I was the rational, logical, practical TV executive, and nobody could have convinced me otherwise. And then I went on a retreat. And someone at that retreat pulled the goddess Kali card that said, "This is the beginning of the end." And within 2 years, my entire life imploded. You've probably heard me talk about this before, but let me just paint you a picture of who I was. I was the one that liked to be in control. I liked to know everything. I didn't like surprises. I wanted evidence. I wanted logic. And I had grown up in a very atheist household. My dad was very anti anything beyond science and what we can see. And so I had lived a life within that conditioning. There was no room for mystery or something beyond what we could see. So I had no patience or no understanding or compassion for anyone who believed there was anything beyond this. I remember eye rolling at people who did. And I know that is shadowy and shameful to admit, but that was the box that I lived in, and I didn't know any different. And I remember when I first walked into this retreat where this card was pulled, and I went to the retreat because, I'll be honest with you, I was desperate for help. This was right at the point of me trying to forget what I had done. And I'd spent a year swallowing it down. And I was driving myself mad. I was in my head the whole time. And it was unbearable. And the reason this retreat appealed to me, it was a 2-day day retreat in London, was because the title of it was Being in Heart. And if I'm honest with you, I didn't really know what it meant to be in your heart, but all of the text around the retreat was get out of your head and be in your heart, get out of thinking and into feeling. And even though this was so beyond anything that I'd ever done before, I knew that I couldn't stay in my head any longer. I was driving myself insane, thinking about what I'd done. Is he going to find out? Am I a bad person? Not being present at any events, just completely disconnected, and just I was somewhere else the whole time. So I thought, great, this retreat sounds like this is what I need. It didn't really make sense to me, but sign me up. I'm going. I'm going to spend, I think it was like £800 for the weekend, and I didn't even care. I was just like, please help me, save me, anything. And I remember as I walked up the steps, I was late because I'm always late. And as I walked up the steps into this retreat, it was like in a converted chapel somewhere in East London. And I had no idea what to expect. And as I walked in through the doors, there was yoga mats all laid out across the entire space, about 20 yoga mats. There was sage smoke burning. There were crystals everywhere. Everywhere you look, there were these big white crystals, which now I know to be quartz, all over the place. There was sheepskin rugs for us to sit on. There was healing music playing, sage smoke burning. And this was not my comfort zone, guys. I was completely out of my comfort zone. But I didn't care because honestly, I was desperate. I was desperate for someone to fix me. And as soon as I sat down on one of the yoga mats, bearing in mind, up until this point, I don't think I'd ever cried in front of a stranger. I barely cried in front of my husband. I think I'd cried in front of him less than a handful of times, less than 5 times in our, by that point, 7-year relationship, 8-year relationship. And as I sat on the yoga mat, surrounded by strangers, I didn't even know the woman who was running the retreat. I just found her on Instagram. I burst into tears. Just tears started streaming down my face. And the only feeling that I can really describe was I felt held in a different way than I ever had done before. And as we went into the retreat and this card was handed to me, I remember sitting there not knowing who the goddess Kali was. The goddess Kali is a Hindu goddess who, almost like the most protective mama bear, can appear in your life at a time where things need to get burnt down to the ground. Things that aren't meant for you, things that are no longer serving you, things that you think you want or you need, but aren't actually doing you any good. And she doesn't care if it's going to hurt. And even though I had no spiritual belief, even though I had not told my husband at this point, I knew this is the beginning of the end. A year and a half later, I had been working one-on-one with the woman who ran the retreat, and I ended up deciding it was time to tell my then husband that I had been unfaithful. And that pain at that time was just unbelievable. The shame and the guilt and the fear of the unknown. Oh, that was wild. I had always wanted to be in control. I'd always wanted to know what was happening. And suddenly it was like somebody had taken away my script and I had no idea of the next act. And since I'd started working with this mentor, I was starting to see all sorts of weird and strange coincidences that started to happen in my life. And she would say things to me that, to begin with, I was like, okay, whatever. But yeah, as it went on, these synchronicities or these moments or these people walking into my life, it just felt too synchronistic. You know, she'd say things like, oh, well, it's not an accident that you had that argument with your dad this weekend, because that is what we've been working on around your unworthiness wound or whatever it might be. It was like the outside world was suddenly mirroring all of the work that I was doing inside this one-on-one coaching that I was going through. And as I started to notice these synchronicities and these moments in time, I was like, oh my gosh, maybe, just maybe, there is something that I'm not aware of. I was starting to see things beyond what I already knew, and it felt terrifying. Like, a spiritual awakening is not rainbows and unicorns and fairies, and it is unbelievably terrifying to start to think or realize or even remember, let's say, that this isn't just about these 3D meat sacks, these bodies that we live and we die, and in the middle we study and we work and we get married and we have babies. There is something bigger going on. We are in some way all connected. Our souls are all connected. We are souls having a human experience. And I was shooketh to the bone. I honestly thought that I was losing my mind, but more evidence seemed to come from the outside that actually I wasn't losing my mind. And perhaps there was something more, and these synchronicities couldn't be denied anymore. I was able to start to trust that perhaps there was a reason why I was going through so much pain. And I started to read more spiritual books. I started to read books like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. In fact, that was the first spiritual book that I read. And then I read The Untethered Soul. I read A Radical Awakening by Dr. Shefali. That is a really good book, by the way. I read books like The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. The Universe Always Has a Plan. That one completely blew my mind, by a guy called Matt Kahn. And as I started to read more spiritual books, I realized, oh my gosh, maybe there really is something else going on. And I want you to remember that I was still deep in shame, deep in guilt, still very confused about what was going on, still not really sure what or how or if I could believe everything that I started to believe. Because that older version of me, the past version of me, would have laughed at me. She'd have told me I was being ridiculous, like there's nothing beyond this. When you die, etc., etc. There was no chance of something bigger than this. You're being conned. Yet the more I went into it, the more I did this work, this soul evolution work, the more books I read, the more podcasts I listened to, the more and more I started to see, whoa, I think that actually there is something bigger. There is a plan. And as I said, the dark night of the soul that ensued in this period, which is ultimately when everything feels like it's crumbling down. Nothing makes sense anymore. You don't know who you are. You don't know who you're becoming. It's terrifying. And I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm just telling you that this wasn't skipping over the rainbow into some la la land. This was an entire dissolution of who I thought I was before I was able to step into who I was becoming. One of the kind of atypical ways people describe this, which I think is just so spot on, is when before a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it goes into the cocoon, and that caterpillar turns into mush. That caterpillar has to forget everything that it thought it knew about who it was, how it moved, how it ate, in order to be able to become the butterfly. And the dark night of the soul, or that moment between who you were and who you're becoming, feels like everything you know has just dissolved into a pile of mush on the floor. And that is exactly how it felt for me. It was very, very scary. And I started to more and more and more lean into the idea that perhaps what I had been going through in this dissolution of my life, even though it was still so painful, do not get me wrong, perhaps there was something more in this. And then I'd shoot back into my 3D self, human self again, and be like, no, Alex, you're being ridiculous. Like, this is just really, really awful time. And then again, I'd start to open myself up to maybe my soul is on some kind of journey. Maybe this was all meant to happen. Maybe there is something more for me on the other side of this. And really and truly, the awakening journey to knowing that this all had to happen exactly as it should, or exactly as it did, I should say, that didn't happen overnight. I spent years and years leaning into the idea that perhaps there is something bigger than what we know. Perhaps we are all connected. Perhaps we are souls having a human experience. Perhaps my soul did show up and decide that this was part of my evolutionary journey in this lifetime. Perhaps I was meant to go through this pain, so I started to wake up to something else. Perhaps I was meant to go through this so that I would quit my career and start a career helping women do the same. The other huge sign for me that this spiritual awakening journey was real and there was a reason I had to go through all of this was just after I had chosen to become celibate. I was walking through Stratford Olympic Park in London, East London, and I remember looking up to the sky and saying, please, universe, send me a man who is happy to wait for me for 6 months so that we can be friends, get to know each other. And if after 6 months of getting to know each other, we are deeply connected, then maybe we can make it physical. And I was petrified of making this decision, because which man was going to want a 39-year-old woman who's basically saying, I'm not going to have sex with you for 6 months? And I was kind of a bit hopeless, to be honest, about that. But I was so determined. And then it was 3 months later that I was standing at the concierge desk of the building that I was living in, talking to this handsome young man who told me that he too was on a celibacy journey. And I just knew that this is not a coincidence. This is a gift. And that turned into us talking, turned into us dating, turned into me trusting, oh my God, I'm about to go away at that moment, I was going to go away for 6 months. And I've just met a man that I honestly think is meant to be in my life. And I trusted for one of the first times in my life, if I go and we are meant to be together, if this is what the universe has planned for me, then he will be here when I return. And we stayed in touch the entire time I was away. He was like a rock to me for that entire time. And lo and behold, just as ayahuasca had said, he was there for me when I got home. When I was away, one of the first things that I did was journey with ayahuasca 4 times. It's very ceremonial. There is a shaman from a local Amazonian tribe called the Shipibo tribe who was holding the ceremonies. And I remember on the second ceremony, I think it was, I was completely blown away, because my intention for the retreat was to open my heart. And the message that I received from the plant, I know it sounds wild, but just trust me, was, in order to open your heart, you have to forgive yourself. And by that point, I thought I'd forgiven myself. And the vision that came to me in that moment was the version of me in that 39-year-old self meeting the 35-year-old version of me who had cheated. And as I held her in my arms, I could feel how lost and confused and sad and lonely and unsure of herself that version was. And I felt so much compassion. I felt so much forgiveness, because I could see that she wasn't a bad woman. She just didn't know what to do with the pain that she was carrying. And it spilled out sideways. And after that, I then started to have these incredible visions in future sessions of me and Adam and the future. And us having 2 children together, and that we were going to love each other deeper than we've ever been loved before. And it was so beautiful. I could not wait to get out of the jungle and tell him about what I had seen and what I had heard. And even though it felt really scary because I'd only met him 6 weeks before, it felt so right. And then in the last ceremony, and this bit is wild, I remember I was terribly uncomfortable. It was like something was really moving through me from almost like my pelvic bowl all the way up through my body, and it was cramping and it felt so hard, and it felt disgusting. And I knew that I was kind of building up to a purge, because during ayahuasca ceremonies you'll often be sick. It's like the energy from your body is like releasing. And I remember saying to the plant, what is this? Like, what is it? And what I heard was, it's the fear of not being loved. And I remember thinking in my like lucid state, what? I've always thought I was loved. I never doubted that. And so I asked the question, where does this come from? And the answer was, it's not yours, it's your mother's. And in that moment, it was like the penny dropped. And I realized so much of the healing that I had to go on was ancestral. And it felt almost like a relief in many ways of what I had been carrying wasn't just mine. All the work that I've been doing on myself wasn't just for me. This had been in the family for a very long time. And that's no one's fault. It's just what it was. And my soul had chosen to be the one to come down and break the chain, break the pattern. And after I got home a few months later, I was telling my mum about this journey. And my mum, she's open-minded, but she's definitely not in this world at all. And I was telling her about this ceremony, and I said, I'd said nothing about her, but I said that I had this message that this uncomfortable feeling in my body was the fear of not being loved. And before I'd said anything, she said, oh, I have that. And I said, yes, Mum, I know. She's like, how did you know? I said, because the plant told me. So I'd gone from being the one to laugh at the shaman when she said the plant had given her these messages, to someone that was now quoting that back to her own mother. But I knew it was true. The plant had told me. And so really and truly, this journey of me trusting and believing and trusting and believing and trusting and believing, slowly but surely was opening me up further and further to more and more magic in my life. You know, when I came home from that trip and Adam and I began a slow journey into our relationship, we didn't hurry into it because we were both very aware that if we were doing this, we were doing this. And it felt like we were meant to be together. It really did. I have never felt such a healthy expression of love. And trust me, we're not perfect. We have a lot of healing and growing and learning still to do, and we're right in it. Yet it felt like our souls had been here before. And rather than trying to rush something, rather than trying to force him to be my boyfriend and for me to be a girlfriend, I just trusted that this journey that we were on was going to take us where it needed to be. I took action towards what I want. I practiced being vulnerable. I practiced being open. I practiced being honest. All the things that I was healing and learning how to be meant I was able to keep opening my heart a little bit more and opening my heart a little bit more and opening my heart a little bit more, slowly letting him in. And a version of me before would have tried to rush that. I'd have rushed it. I'd have tried to force it. I'd have tried to label it, but I didn't. And it was in this unbelievable trust and surrender that I had managed to cultivate over the years that I was able to let him hold me. In fact, I was able to let life hold me. I stopped believing that I had to control everything. I believed that if I could trust that everything was working out for me, even the really most painful, gnarly bits of life, because the real truth is that life is gnarly. There are going to be painful moments in life. There is death, there is destruction, there is infidelity, there is pain. And it's just that we try to go through life without feeling any of that or seeing any of it, because it feels so scary. How can we hold ourselves through that? How can I possibly get over that? How am I possibly going to be able to grieve that relationship or that person or that thing? I can't deal with that pain. But the truth is, I started to trust that I could. And that this life that I was building wasn't about how hard I could push or how much I could control or how much I could try and stop myself from feeling all of the bad things. It was like, can I allow myself to feel the bad things and trust that maybe, just maybe, there was going to be something on the other side of this? Maybe, just maybe, I don't have to control and keep myself tight and gripping on to things that maybe aren't serving me anymore. I'd spent most of my life believing that if I worked hard enough, if I planned carefully enough, if I controlled hard enough, then I could make life happen. But what I eventually learned was that some of the most beautiful things in my life arrived when I stopped gripping so tightly. And so maybe just taking a moment to reflect, where are you trying to control everything? What if you don't have to know how this ends? What if your life isn't over? What if you're standing in the middle of a chapter, not the end of a book? And so if you're in the middle of the aftermath right now, I know really, truly how impossible it feels to believe there could be anything on the other side. And I know that because I couldn't see it either. But sometimes we need to sit with other women who can see possibilities that we can't yet see for ourselves. And that's why the sanctuary exists. So if you're right in the middle of this, in this very moment, and you need a safe place to land, then see the link in my bio. Thank you for listening to the Deeper Love podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you're ready to go deeper, you'll find all the ways to work with me in the show notes. Until next time.